There is a particular kind of invisible that isn't about being overlooked by accident. It isn't the kind where someone forgets your name in a crowded room, or loses track of your birthday in the chaos of a busy month, or simply never quite knows what to say to you because you're quieter than the others, more complicated to reach. That kind of invisible has a softness to it, a human explanation, an apology behind it somewhere, waiting. The kind I know is different. The kind I know is deliberate. It has grammar. It has architecture. It is built, brick by careful brick, over years and decades, until the structure is so solid that the person inside it can barely remember a time before the walls. My mother built that structure around me with the patience of someone who genuinely believed I shouldn't take up space. And the most disturbing part, the part that kept me awake more nights than I can count, was how effortlessly she did it. Not with screaming, not with cruelty that left visible marks, just with the quiet, practiced art of leaving me out of sentences. Of teaching everyone in her orbit that there were 2 children worth mentioning, and then whatever Claire was. I am 29 years old. I have known this about my mother since I was approximately 5, and for 24 years, I convinced myself that if I was patient enough, present enough, useful enough, she would eventually turn toward me the way she turned toward Richard and Emma, with warmth, with recognition, with the particular brightness in someone's eyes that tells you they are genuinely glad you exist. She never did, but it wasn't until my brother's wedding 3 years ago that I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. The wedding was in July, one of those rare lead summer days where the sky actually cooperated, pale blue and generous, the kind of afternoon that makes you feel the city is showing off a little. Richard had married Beth in a church out in Harrogate, and the reception was in a converted mill building with exposed beams and long candlelit tables. It was beautiful. I remember thinking that. I was wearing a navy dress I'd saved up for, and I'd done my makeup carefully. And I was genuinely happy for my brother because whatever complicated feelings I had about my family, I loved Richard. He was oblivious in the way that only middle children can be, not unkind, just somehow perpetually unaware that anything difficult was happening around him. He moved through our family with the ease of someone who had never needed to notice. I was standing near the back of the room, holding my niece, Beth's sister's daughter, 2 years old and inexplicably obsessed with my earrings, when my mother stood at the head table and raised her glass. She had prepared remarks. Of course she had. My mother is the kind of woman who prepares remarks. She spoke about Richard's childhood, about the qualities she'd always known would make him a wonderful husband. She spoke about Beth with genuine warmth, welcoming her into the family with that practiced grace she reserved for people she'd chosen. And then she said, "I am so proud of my 2 beautiful children and the futures they're building. 2 beautiful children." Emma was sitting at the head table, just to my mother's left. I saw her go still. She didn't look at me, which told me she'd heard exactly what I'd heard. 47 people in that room. I counted them later because that is the kind of thing you do when you're trying to establish that something real happened, that you are not, in fact, losing your mind. I waited until the next morning, when the family had gathered for a breakfast at Richard and Beth's hotel, to ask her about it. Do you know how someone looks when they've already prepared an answer to a question they're hoping you won't ask? There's a smoothness to their face that arrives just slightly too fast. My mother had that smoothness as I approached her at the breakfast table with my cup of tea and my carefully constructed calm. I said quietly that I'd noticed what she'd said. About 2 children. She didn't even put down her fork. She said, "Don't be so sensitive, Claire. You know what I meant." And the thing is, she was right. I did know what she meant. I had always known. The wedding toast was just the moment it became undeniable in the presence of witnesses. But I'd known it in 100 smaller ways before that. I'd known it at every Christmas where 2 stockings hung over the fireplace in the front room of the house in Headingley, carefully embroidered ones, the kind you ordered from a craft shop, with Richard in red thread and Emma in green, while mine was a plain felt thing kept in a drawer, my name written in Sharpie because someone had gotten around to it eventually, just not with any care. I'd known it at my university graduation when my mother simply didn't come. She had said later that she'd got the dates confused, but Richard's graduation had been in a framed photograph on the mantelpiece for years. I'd known it every time she introduced Richard and Emma to her book club friends, her pottery class friends, Margaret and the others, while I stood beside them like a feature of the wallpaper. Do not be so sensitive. You know what I meant. She'd meant all of it, every time. And she'd spent 26 years counting on me to absorb the blows quietly and then wonder privately if I was overreacting. There was a school play when I was 9. Our primary school was doing a production of a Joseph musical, and I had been cast as the narrator, the lead role, the one with the most songs, the one who stood at the front and carried the whole story on her shoulders. I had rehearsed for 6 weeks. I knew every word, every musical cue, had sung myself to sleep, going over every bridge and chorus with the focused seriousness of a 9-year-old who has decided that something matters enormously. My father came. He sat in the 3rd row with a camcorder the size of a small dog and filmed the whole thing and came backstage afterwards saying, "You were fantastic, love. Absolutely fantastic." My mother had not come. She said later that she'd got confused about the date, thought there was another performance the following week. But she had attended Emma's ballet recital the Saturday before without the slightest uncertainty about scheduling. Emma was 7. She'd performed a 2-minute butterfly routine in a pink tutu. My mother had brought flowers for her at the stage door. There was a family holiday in Cornwall when I was 12. I slipped on wet rocks at the beach, a proper slip, the kind that shredded my knee badly enough to require an emergency trip to the minor injuries unit in Truro. While I sat in the waiting room with blood soaking through the cloth my father had pressed against it, my mother sat beside me and looked at her watch twice. I remember noticing the watch, the way her eyes tracked to it and then to the door, as though the logistics of the afternoon had become inconvenient in ways she was tallying. My father held my hand throughout. My mother's hand stayed in her lap. I had a serious relationship at 22 with a man named Adam who was thoughtful and kind and made proper coffee from beans. He ground himself and read books with actual arguments in them. He came to a family dinner once. He was warm and attentive and made my mother laugh twice, which I tracked with the precision of someone who has learned to note such things. Afterward, walking back to his car, he said, "Your mum's really lovely." And I made a choice in that moment, whether to explain the full architecture of what he hadn't seen, or simply to say yes, she can be. I said the second. It was both easier and, in some precise technical sense, accurate. She could be lovely. She was with him. She was with anyone who wasn't me. The pattern was not spectacular. That was the point. Spectacular cruelty creates witnesses. Quiet, structural erasure creates confusion in the people around you and in yourself. The most consistent feature of what she did was its deniability. There was always an explanation available, always a softer reading she could hand back to me when I tried to name it. "You're oversensitive. You've misremembered. It was a different week." The flowers were already at the shop. It wasn't deliberate. It was never deliberate, except that it was, systematically, for 26 years. After the wedding, Emma and I started counting. Not obsessively. We weren't cataloging every slight, every omission. But when something happened, we noted it. By the time we sat down and compared our notes about a year later, we had found 5 separate occasions when our mother had referred to her 2 children in contexts where all 3 of us were either present or being directly discussed. 5 times. Not slips of the tongue. A pattern. The kind of pattern that only looks accidental if you've never had to pay attention to it. Emma cried when we went through the list together. She kept saying, "I should have said something. I should have called her out right there." I told her that calling it out wouldn't have changed anything. You cannot argue someone into seeing you as a person. Either they already do or they don't. My mother had made her choice so long ago that by the time I was an adult, it probably felt to her like simple fact. She had 2 children, Richard and Emma. And Claire was just something that had also happened, some adjacent situation she'd been saddled with that hadn't turned out the way she'd hoped. Emma cried for a long time that evening after we compared our notes. We were at her kitchen table in the flat she'd rented in Chapel Allerton, the plane trees outside dropping their bark in strips of silver and gold. And I made tea, because making tea is what you do when the real need is impossible to address. She kept saying she should have called Mum out years ago, at the wedding, at every other occasion where it had happened. I kept telling her it wouldn't have changed anything, and I believed that, but I also understood why she needed to say it. She needed somewhere to put the weight of having watched it and said nothing. After a while she looked up and said, "Why didn't it ever break you? The way I mean it. Completely. You always seemed present, together." I thought about that. I said, "I think it did break things, just gradually, and in places I didn't notice immediately. I built walls efficient enough that I mistook them for personality," she said. "That's the saddest thing you've ever said to me." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I need to know for certain, not just for myself, but because I've spent my whole life being told I'm imagining it, and I want proof. Not proof to show her. You cannot present evidence to someone and expect them to love you. I want proof to carry. Something that makes the thing I've always known into a fact I can hold. Something solid enough that the next time she says, 'Don't be so sensitive,' I have the answer ready, even if I never say it out loud, even if it's only for me." Emma was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me what you need me to do." That yes is something I've come back to in the months since. Emma, who loves my mother, who had every reason to ask me to let it alone, said yes without hesitation. That is its own kind of counted. I want you to understand what that does to a person. Not the dramatic version of it, not the version that makes for easy narrative. The quiet version. The version where you go through your entire childhood being technically provided for, housed, fed, clothed, present at every dinner table, while simultaneously understanding on some cellular level that your presence is an imposition. Where you learn to make yourself smaller, not because anyone asked you to explicitly, but because the alternative is watching someone you love demonstrate, again and again, that they'd prefer you weren't there. You get good at being convenient, easy, low maintenance. You stop asking for things you won't get. You develop a kind of internal self-sufficiency that looks to outsiders like independence and feels from the inside like a wound that healed wrong. By the time I was 29, I had moved to London, built a career in design work, made a small, good life for myself. I was fine. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely fine, in the way that people are fine when they've done enough work on themselves to stop bleeding openly. But I was also still carrying something I hadn't been able to put down. The question I couldn't answer. The thing I needed to know for my own sanity, my own clarity, the part of me that a decade of therapy and distance and building a separate life hadn't quite reached. Was I imagining it? Had I, through some unconscious process of grievance accumulation, turned ordinary maternal coolness into something darker? Or was this woman genuinely capable of warmth? Warmth she had chosen, repeatedly, deliberately, to withhold from me and give to everyone else? I needed to know, not for her. You cannot present evidence to someone and expect them to love you. I needed to know for myself. I needed to see it plainly, without the distortion of 29 years of being her daughter, without the complicated emotional lens that makes it impossible to see your own family clearly. I needed to see her with new eyes. Or more precisely, I needed her to think she was seeing someone with no history and watch what she did. The plan came together over 6 weeks in September and October. I talked it through with Emma, who had moved back to Leeds the previous year and was living in Chapel Allerton. Emma was the only person who could make this work. She understood the stakes. She'd been a witness to enough of it that she wasn't dismissing me or trying to soften the truth. The plan was not elaborate. That was the point. It couldn't be theatrical. My mother would see through anything that required real performance. What I needed was the most minimal disguise possible. Just a different name, a different context, and the assumption that someone who had never properly looked at me would continue not looking. I would use my middle name, Jane. I would wear my hair up instead of down. Not because it would change my face significantly, but because it would signal a different person in the way that small changes sometimes do. I would speak in the register of someone slightly more formal with a near stranger, which was all my mother needed to hear to decide she was meeting someone new. And Emma would introduce me as Claire's flatmate from London, visiting Leeds for a work project. That was it. That was the entire disguise. And the reason I thought it would work, the reason it did work, was that my mother had never truly looked at me. When you have spent 30 years not seeing someone, when you have systematically trained your eyes to slide past them, you lose the capacity for detailed recognition. She would not see Claire with her hair up. She would see Jane, Claire's flatmate, a new person to be charmed. Because charming new people was something my mother was genuinely, almost professionally good at. Richard knew nothing. He was not capable of keeping this secret. Not because he was dishonest, but because he was the kind of person who processed everything out loud, whose face telegraphed every thought he had. He would have given it away within the first hour, probably while trying to be helpful. We let him believe Emma had a friend visiting from London, which was, in a technical sense, entirely true. Emma's flat was the right base of operations. Small, warm, on a residential street with mature trees dropping their November leaves over the pavements. I arrived on a Tuesday, rolling my bag through the mist that had settled over Leeds like something the city had exhaled, and stood for a moment outside her building, feeling the strange weight of what I was about to do. Not fear exactly, something more like the stillness before something that cannot be undone. Leeds had a particular way of receiving me that London had never learned. London is permanently present tense. It doesn't retain your history, which is both its freedom and its loneliness. Leeds remembered. The streets around Emma's flat had November light that fell sideways and gold, making even ordinary terraced houses look considered, deliberate. I had walked these pavements as a child, as a teenager, as the kind of young adult who is still carrying their upbringing in ways they cannot yet inventory. The bus stop 2 streets over where I had waited every school morning, always slightly too early, preferring the quiet before the other children arrived. The small park at the corner where I had learned to ride a bicycle, my father running alongside holding the seat, the specific wobbling terror, and then the sudden understanding of balance. The city was mine in a way that had nothing to do with my mother. She had not given me Leeds. Leeds had given itself to me through simple proximity, through years, through the particular physics of a childhood happening inside it. I walked through the mist and felt the specific comfort of being somewhere that did not require me to explain myself. Emma met me at the door, and we stood in her kitchen for an hour before dinner, drinking tea and running through the details one final time. She was nervous in a way she kept trying to hide, which made me love her more than I already did. She had a tendency to want to protect everyone at once, and she was caught between protecting me and not wanting to hurt my mother, and knowing, somewhere underneath all of that the truth was going to do what truth does, regardless of anyone's preferences. I told her, let it happen. Whatever happens, let it happen. I'm not going there to explode anything. I'm going to observe. And then, at the Sunday dinner, we'll let her say it one more time with me in the room, and then she'll know that I know, and then we'll all know where we stand. Emma exhaled slowly and said, "Okay," and she refilled my tea. That first dinner at my mother's house on Tuesday evening, I can tell you exactly what it smelled like when she opened the door. Lamb roasting, rosemary, the particular warm, closed-off smell of a house with the heating turned up against a November night. My mother's house in Headingley, the Victorian semi-detached with the blue door, which I had painted myself when I was 16 and furious about something entirely unrelated, painting it blue just because I could, because it felt like claiming one small piece of that house as mine. She'd kept the color. I didn't know what to do with that. She opened the door and looked at Emma, and then at me, and I watched her face do the thing I had been counting on, the polite, bright smile of someone greeting a guest. Emma said, "Mum, this is Jane, Claire's flatmate from London. She's up for a work project, and I said she could join us while she's in town." My mother said, "How lovely to meet you, Jane. Please come in. I've made a lamb roast. I do hope you eat meat." I had been vegetarian for 7 years. She had never once remembered this. The detail cost me something, sitting in the November cold on her doorstep under a name that wasn't mine. But I filed it, the way I had been filing things for 24 years, and I stepped inside. I said, "I do. Thank you so much. This is so kind." She said, "Nonsense. Any friend of Emma's is welcome here. Please, sit anywhere." And then she poured me wine without asking if I wanted it, and asked about my fictional marketing job, and passed me the breadbasket, and smiled across the table with the full warmth of a woman who was genuinely pleased to have company. I sat in her dining room and watched her be gracious, and felt something move through me that I couldn't quite name yet. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that had been waiting for confirmation for a very long time. She asked about my fictional life in London for 20 minutes. She asked if I'd been to Leeds before, and when I said no, which was technically true, Jane hadn't been, Claire had grown up here, she immediately began recommending things. "Roundhay Park," she said. "You must walk around the lake. It's beautiful even in November. That particular grey-blue November light, the geese on the water. And the market in Kirkgate if you like that sort of thing." And she leaned forward slightly in the way she had when she was drawing someone in, when she'd decided she liked them, when they had passed some private test she administered to everyone she met, and she said, "I'm so glad Emma brought you. It's nice to have new faces at the table." And then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "How do you find living with Claire? I imagine she can be a bit scattered. She always was, even as a small child." Emma's fork stopped moving against her plate for just a second. I heard it. I kept my expression pleasant, curious, the face of someone receiving mildly amusing information about a flatmate. I said, "Oh, she seems pretty organized to me." My mother laughed a small, tolerant laugh. She said, "Well, you're charitable. I raised that girl, and I can tell you she's always been a bit all over the place. Not like Emma, who's always known what she wanted. Claire just sort of drifts." There it was. The first one, delivered with such practiced ease that it barely sounded like anything at all. The contempt dressed in fond exasperation, the cruelty that comes wearing the costume of bemused parental observation. She'd said worse things to my face, but hearing it from the back, aimed at a stranger who was supposed to nod sympathetically, that had a texture to it I hadn't anticipated. I said, and let her move on. She moved on easily and graciously, the way she moved through all social difficulty, by treating it as something already behind her. She poured more wine, unprompted, and told me about Emma's childhood, about what Emma had been like as a small girl. Determined, she said, always with some project on, always wanting to know how things worked. She smiled the way people smile at memories they've earned the right to be proud of. She said, "Emma's always known what she wanted, even at 4 years old." She'd make these elaborate lists of what she was going to do that day, with little checkboxes she'd tick off one at a time. I was a list maker too. I had been a list maker from approximately age 7, filling spiral notebooks with plans and systems and catalogs of things I found interesting. I sat at my mother's table and listened to her describe Emma's lists as a distinctive personal quality, and I thought of my own notebooks, 22 years of them, stacked in boxes in a flat she had never visited, and said nothing. She asked what I had studied at university, and I told her. Graphic design, which was true because it was Jane's story, but also Claire's story, because there was no other story. She said, "Oh, that's interesting. Richard actually looked into something creative early on, but he ended up going into finance, and it suits him perfectly. She nodded at this the way she did when something had resolved as she'd hoped. Then she looked at me and said, does design work actually pay well? I hear a lot of young people struggle with that transition. She had never once asked about my work. In 29 years, in all the dinners at this table, the question had not been posed. I was sitting in her dining room under a different name, and she was asking with the genuine curiosity of someone who had decided she was interested in the answer. I told her that it paid well when you found your niche, that I had been lucky with clients who understood what they were asking for. She said, "Good for you. That's the thing with creative work. It requires such faith in your own eye." Such faith. I had never heard her say anything like that about anything that involved me. Wednesday I spent in the city, working remotely from a coffee shop near the Corn Exchange, watching the pigeons and the students and the November light go thin and silver by 2 in the afternoon. I walked down the calls in the evening and ate dinner alone in a small Italian place, and I let myself feel the peculiar freedom of being somewhere I had grown up while being someone else. Leeds had the same bones it always had. The Victorian grandeur gone slightly to seed in places, the old textile money in the architecture, the river running through it dark and purposeful. I had never quite stopped feeling like this city was mine. My mother had not been able to take that from me. I called my friend Priya that evening from the restaurant, between courses, keeping my voice low because the tables were close together. Priya had known me for 11 years, since we'd been at college together, and she was one of maybe 3 people in the world who understood the full shape of what my family was like, because she'd had a version of her own to deal with, and we had compared notes with the careful shorthand of people who have earned each other's trust across a long time. She said, "How are you doing?" Actually, I thought about it. I said, "I'm in the city I grew up in, eating dinner alone, being someone else. I don't know if that's sad or liberating." She said, "It sounds like both, which you've always been good at holding at once." I said, "She invited Jane to a pottery class tomorrow." There was a pause. She said, "Seriously, she invited Jane to a pottery class." I said, "Yes." She said, "Has she ever invited you to anything?" I said, "No." There was a longer pause. Then she said, "Go to the pottery class and call me after." I told her I would, and I did, on Friday, after everything had clarified in the way that only very cold water clarifies. Thursday I went back to the house in Headingley in the afternoon. My mother had called Emma to ask if Jane might want to see some of the local history, which was so exactly, so achingly the thing she had never done for me that I almost didn't trust myself to go through with the afternoon. But I went, and we walked to the park, and she told me about the history of the area, the cloth merchants and the mill workers, the way the city had been built on the industry of people who worked hard for little, and she was interesting and warm and knowledgeable, and I found myself, in spite of everything, genuinely enjoying her company in the way you might enjoy the company of a stranger you've just met. That was the thing I hadn't prepared myself for. How good she could be at this. How much warmth she had in her, available and generous and real, for the right person. The cruelty was not in her coldness. The cruelty was in the selection, the careful, deliberate choosing of who received the warmth and who didn't. At the end of the walk, standing on the path with the lake behind us, she said, "I'd love you to come to my pottery class tomorrow afternoon. I go every week. It's quite meditative. I think you'd enjoy it." She had never invited me to anything in my adult life. The walk had lasted nearly 2 hours. She had talked for most of it, but the talking was different from the polished performance of the dinner table. This was her actual mind, moving through things it found genuinely interesting. She told me about the history of the park, the Victorian vision of it, the cloth merchants who had funded it as a public amenity for the workers they employed, the complicated morality of that philanthropy, giving parks to the people you've kept in poverty and calling it generosity. I was struck by how thoughtful she was about it. Not in the way you are thoughtful about things you've read once, but in the way you are thoughtful about things you have continued to consider over time. She asked me about London with genuine interest, the kind that wanted specific answers rather than polite ones. She asked what I loved about living there and what frustrated me. And when I said the anonymity could be wearing after a while, that sometimes you wanted to be somewhere with a memory of you in it, she nodded slowly and said, "That's exactly it. That's what I find about city living generally. It costs you history. You pay for the freedom with the continuity." She said that very quietly, almost to herself, and I realized she was not talking to me so much as thinking out loud, that I had said something that had opened a door in her own thinking, and she had walked through it without noticing I was still standing there. This was the thing about her at her best. She genuinely thought. When she was engaged, she was actually engaged. The light was fully on. She had simply decided, somewhere long ago, that the light would not come on for me. I said I'd love to, and I went, because not going would have been a missed observation. We sat at the wheel in a warm studio in Headingley, and she showed me how to center the clay, patient and gentle, her hands over mine to correct the pressure, and she laughed when I produced something that was trying to be a bowl and had become a kind of flattened mushroom shape. She laughed warmly, genuinely, and she said, "Don't worry. It took me 3 months to make anything that didn't collapse." In 29 years, she had never once helped me with something without attaching criticism to the end of it. I put the mushroom bowl on the drying shelf, and I thought, with a clarity that felt like ice water, I am not crazy. I have never been crazy. Friday afternoon was when I got the confirmation I hadn't known I was still waiting for. Emma's old bedroom, mine, had been converted into a craft room 18 months after I moved out for university, which was its own small statement. The physical erasure of my occupancy looked out over the back garden. I was working at the small desk by the window when I heard voices below. The kitchen window was open a crack, the way my mother always kept it when she was cooking, and sound carried up through the cold air with strange clarity. Margaret's voice first, asking after my mother's garden plans, whether the tulips were in yet. Then my mother's voice, easy and comfortable in the way she was with her long-time friends. Then Margaret said, "That Jane seems pleasant. How's your Claire doing anyway? Still down in London?" And my mother said, "Oh, Claire." 2 words. That was all she needed. "Oh, Claire." And then the shift in tone, that particular shift, that specifically engineered dismissive warmth that I had heard my whole life and had never been able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't heard it themselves. Like opening a door to a room and finding it smaller and less interesting than expected. Honestly, Margaret, I don't know what to do with that girl. She's always been difficult. Richard and Emma, they were just easy children. Sensible, successful, the sort you don't worry about because they have direction. But Claire just drifts. No proper career, no husband, nothing she's really built. Sometimes I think she actively tries to disappoint me, like she's chosen it somehow. I had stopped breathing. I was aware of this as an abstract fact, that my chest had simply suspended its normal operations while I stood very still and listened to my mother explain me to Margaret with the weary authority of someone who had long since given up on a disappointing appliance. Margaret's voice came back, and Margaret, who I had always liked, who had always been one of the kinder presences in my mother's orbit, said gently, "That's a bit harsh, Anne." And my mother said, "Is it? I gave that girl everything, the same opportunities as the others, same schools, same support, everything I gave Richard and Emma, but she's just never quite measured up, has she? I've stopped expecting anything, honestly. It's easier that way. You reach a point where you have to protect yourself. I've stopped expecting anything. It's easier that way." I wrote it down. Not because I'd forgotten it. I wrote it down because writing it made it solid, made it the thing it was, which was a fact, a documented fact. a piece of evidence I was going to carry into that dining room on Sunday and lay on the table alongside everything else. Margaret said something I couldn't hear clearly, and then her voice came back with a firmness I appreciated. Well, I've always found Claire perfectly lovely, very capable. My mother said, which was what she said when she was allowing a statement to stand without agreeing with it. I had been braced for this in the way you brace for something you've known was coming for 24 years. I had told myself during the 6 weeks of planning that whatever I heard in that house would not destroy me, that I was coming here specifically to hear it, and hearing it would therefore be a victory of evidence rather than a wound. I had believed that logic completely. Sitting at the desk with the voices coming up through the window, I realized I had also been wrong. The grief arrived anyway. The way grief always arrives, bypassing the logical mind entirely and landing somewhere older and deeper. Not because she'd said anything new. She had been saying versions of this for my entire life. But there is a particular quality to hearing the things said about you in your absence, to the person you were not supposed to hear. A quality of witnessing the clean, unperformed version of someone's regard. In my presence, my mother modulated. She softened the language, maintained the deniability. But in that kitchen with the window open, talking to Margaret with the comfortable openness of someone who believed they were unobserved, she had said the actual thing. Not the managed version. The thing itself. I've stopped expecting anything. It's easier that way. I thought about the 5-year-old version of me who had felt the temperature difference and not known the word for it. I thought about every year between her and now. And I sat with it, the full weight of it, and I did not minimize it or argue with it or make it smaller than it was. I let it be the size it actually was. That, it turned out, was its own kind of practice. I sat at that desk for a long time after their voices moved away from the window. I sat there, and I let the thing I had heard settle through me, past the initial impact, past the complicated grief of it, into the place where clarity lives. Because that was what I had come here for. Not the warmth she'd shown Jane. Though that was important, that was one edge of the proof. But this was the center. The warmth for strangers and the contempt for me were not contradictions. They were two sides of the same coin, and the coin was a choice. She was choosing. She had always been choosing. She had not been shaped by me into difficulty. I had not been difficult in ways that made me unlovable. She had simply decided, somewhere in my infancy or childhood or whenever it happened, that I was not the one she wanted. And she had spent 3 decades making sure I knew it, through the careful grammar of her silences and omissions, while also making sure she could always call me oversensitive if I ever said so out loud. Saturday was kitchen prep day. Emma had said I should come, that Mum wanted help with the Sunday dinner, and that this was important. I needed to be there for these ordinary hours. I needed to be in the kitchen beside her, doing the ordinary work of cooking, so that when Sunday came, the contrast would be undeniable to everyone in the room. She had made me feel welcome. She had chosen me. She just hadn't known who I was. So I stood at the counter in my mother's kitchen on a gray November Saturday, and I chopped parsnips and listened to her tell me about the garden, about her plans for spring, about how she was thinking of extending the raised beds along the back fence, maybe lavender, maybe some roses. She asked my opinion on a birthday gift for Emma, whether I thought Emma would prefer a particular cookbook or tickets to a show she'd mentioned. She poured us both a glass of wine at 3 p.m. and said, "This is exactly the sort of afternoon I love. Good company. Something useful to do with the hands. Good company. I was good company. I had always been good company. I had cooked in this kitchen 100 times, and never once had my mother poured me wine at 3 and called me good company. We were making the same lamb roast she had made on Tuesday, her signature winter Sunday meal, the one she'd been making since before I could properly sit at the table. The lamb went in at 11, and for the next few hours we worked in the particular rhythm of 2 people who are comfortable in a kitchen together. She had put Radio 4 on at low volume, the way she always did when she cooked, and we moved around each other without getting in the way, And she talked about the garden, and I listened and offered thoughts when she asked for them. And it was so ordinary, so warmly ordinary, that I had to keep reminding myself what it was. She told me about a pottery piece she was working on, a set of small serving dishes she was making for her friend Margaret as a Christmas gift. She described them with the specific happiness of someone who has found a creative practice late and been surprised by how much it gives them. She said, "I was never very artistic when I was young. I thought I wasn't that sort of person. Then at 53, I sat at a pottery wheel and discovered I was, after all." She laughed, a small, rueful laugh at herself, pleased and a little disbelieving. She said, "It's never too late to find out who you actually are." I thought, with considerable irony, yes, it is never too late, which cuts both ways. And then she said, "You're so easy to talk to, Jane. I feel like I've known you for ages. You really must come back. Next time Claire comes up, you should come together." I said I'd like that. And I meant it in a way she didn't understand. I thought, yes, I will come back. I'm coming back tomorrow with something you gave me this week without knowing it, and I'm going to hand it back to you in front of everyone. The swallowing glass feeling had been there all week. That particular irony of being welcomed and warmed by the woman who had built her life's work around making me feel the opposite. But by Saturday evening, it had transformed into something harder and clearer. Not bitterness, resolve. The kind of quiet, absolute certainty that comes when you have stopped hoping for a different outcome and accepted the one that was always there. You know how long I had been hoping for a different outcome? 24 years. Since the first time I understood what was happening, since I was 5 years old and some wordless part of me registered the temperature difference. The way she held me and held Emma was not the same. I had been hoping, in various forms and with varying degrees of awareness, for 24 years. That is a long time to carry something. I put it down on Saturday evening in my sister's flat in Chapel Allerton, sitting on her couch with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside me. I put it down the way you put down a bag you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. And I felt, underneath the grief of it, something that was almost relief. Almost. Sunday came in with fog. Leeds in November does fog with genuine commitment. Not the thin mist of a half-hearted morning, but real fog. The kind that swallows the ends of streets and makes the Victorian chimneys appear to float. I walked to my mother's house from Emma's flat, which took 25 minutes and which I spent mostly silent, letting my feet know the old pavements, the cracks and slopes I'd learned as a child. The blue door appeared out of the fog before I expected it. Still blue. Inside, the house was warm and crowded with the organized chaos of before a dinner. Beth and Richard had arrived. Beth's parents, Janet and Graham, were already in the sitting room with Sherry and 2 family friends whose names I was using my Jane context to avoid knowing. Emma gave me a long look when I came in, a look that asked without asking if I was still sure. I nodded once. My mother was in the kitchen, and she smiled when she saw me, a wide, genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Jane," she said, "I'm so glad you could come. Come and help me with the gravy." I stood at the stove beside her and stirred the gravy, and she talked about the fog, about a film she'd seen recently, about how much she'd enjoyed our walk earlier in the week. She touched my shoulder once, lightly, affectionately, while reaching past me for the wooden spoon. A casual physical warmth she would not have extended to me in my actual identity. I registered it and said nothing and kept stirring. When we sat down at the table, 11 people arranged around the long dining room table with the good cloth and the candles, my mother at the head looking genuinely, thoroughly pleased with herself and her home and her gathered people, I looked around the table and I thought, this is it. This is the room where it happens. Emma was beside me. Her hand was under the table, and she had gripped her napkin in a fist that she then released and smoothed flat. Richard was across from us, telling Beth's father something about a work project with his usual cheerful, oblivious energy. Beth sat beside him, looking pretty and slightly tired. Janet and Graham had brought a bottle of wine they were describing at some length. The family friends, whose names I was now registering as Philip and Sheila, were talking about something they'd seen at the West Yorkshire Playhouse. And then my mother stood. She had that expression she always wore before she said something she'd prepared, poised, a small gathering of herself. She picked up her wine glass, and the table quieted in the way tables do when the host rises. She smiled. "I'd like us to go around the table and share something we're grateful for," she said. "It's that time of year. I'll start." The room was pleasantly attentive. Someone shifted a wine glass. Philip nodded encouragingly. My mother looked around the table with that warm, practiced smile that I had spent a week watching her deploy on a stranger, and she said, "I'm grateful for my health, for this beautiful home, which I love. And most of all, I am grateful that I have 2 wonderful children who have made me so proud. 2 wonderful children." The silence that followed was immediate and specific, not the comfortable silence of people preparing their own answers. A different silence, the kind with edges. Emma's face had gone the color of the white cloth on the table. I watched it happen. I watched her look at me with an expression that was equal parts horror and something I can only describe as witnessed. The look of someone who has been telling you for years that they saw what you saw, and now is watching it proven again in the most inescapable way possible. Richard's face showed a simpler thing, confusion. He had genuinely not heard it. He looked slightly puzzled, the way he always looked when he sensed tension he hadn't tracked the source of. Beth had caught something. Her eyes moved carefully to Emma, then to me. Janet, Beth's mother, had gone still in the polite, deliberate way of a woman who has just witnessed something she doesn't know what to do with. I sat at that table with the weight of 8 days and 29 years compressed into a single still moment, and I thought, with perfect clarity, here we are. Emma moved first. She put down her wine glass, and she stood. "Mum," she said. Her voice was very even. "Before we continue, there's something you should know." My mother looked at her with the mild concern of someone who does not yet understand what is coming. "What is it, darling?" she said. Emma looked at me. She gestured, a small motion, barely perceptible. I stood. And something happened to my body that I had not fully planned for, which was this. It straightened. Not performatively, not as a conscious choice. The posture I had been holding all week, Jane's posture, slightly deferential, slightly smaller, the unconscious self-minimizing of a visitor in someone else's space, released. My spine found its natural alignment. My shoulders dropped and settled. My chin came up by perhaps half an inch. It was the posture I had learned not to use in this house. Emma said, "Jane isn't Jane, she's Claire." I let the silence run for 2 full seconds. Then I said, "Hello, Mum." What happened to my mother's face in that moment is something I have gone over many times in the months since, trying to find the right words for it. It was not a single expression. It was several expressions in rapid succession, like watching a hand of cards get turned over one at a time. First, the genuine blankness of incomprehension. The brain receiving information it does not yet know how to process. Then a flicker of something that wanted to be denial. Then the horrible, slow arrival of recognition, not just of who I was, but of what that meant. The full backward understanding of the week, of Jane, of everything she had said and done with the full warmth she had, all of it slamming into her at once. Then something I had not expected. Fear. Something genuinely afraid moved across her face and was gone. She said very quietly, "Claire, what is this?" I had thought about this moment for 6 weeks. I had run through different versions of what I might say. Angry versions, cold versions, careful, precise versions. What actually came out of me was none of those things. It was simply true. I said, "This is 8 days of you being kinder to a stranger than you have ever been to your own daughter. This is me watching you pour wine at 3 in the afternoon and call someone good company. This is me watching you invite a woman you'd known for 48 hours to your pottery class. This is me watching you ask Jane for her opinion and listen to her answers. I said, you just stood up in front of 11 people and told them you're grateful for your 2 wonderful children. I'm your 3rd child, Mum. I was sitting 6 feet away from you. I have been sitting 6 feet away from you for my entire life. My mother's face had gone a dark, uneven red. She said, you're being ridiculous. It was a figure of speech. I don't know why you always... No. I said it, and I meant it, and the word came out with a certainty that surprised even me. Not raised, not angry, just absolutely firm, the word of someone who has finished absorbing blows. No, I said, you don't get to do that. You don't get to reach for that word again. I know what sensitive means in this family. Sensitive means don't point out what you're doing. Sensitive means absorb it quietly so I don't have to account for it. You've been calling me sensitive for 29 years, and I've been sitting with it, and I'm done sitting with it. I pulled out my phone. I had been keeping notes all week, not covert recordings, nothing dramatic, just notes, the way I had always kept notes. The way you do when you've learned not to trust your own memory because someone has spent your whole life telling you you're imagining things. I said, you told Margaret yesterday afternoon that I'm difficult, that I drift, that I've never measured up. You said you've stopped expecting anything from me because it's easier, your exact words. My mother said, you were eavesdropping, I said. I was in your house, standing by a window, and your voice carried. But more importantly, does it matter how I heard it? Is the problem that I heard it, or that you said it? The room was the quietest it had ever been. I was aware of it peripherally, the 11 people around that table in various states of stillness and stunned attention. Richard had stopped looking confused. He was looking at his mother with an expression I had never seen on him before, something working itself out in real time. Beth had quietly put her hand on Richard's arm, a small gesture, the instinct of a spouse who senses their partner navigating something they haven't encountered before, a hand that says, I'm here, take your time, I'm not going anywhere. I noticed it the way you notice small acts of ordinary steadiness in the middle of extraordinary instability. Philip said, very quietly, and to no one in particular, I see. Just those 2 words. Philip, whom I had never met before in my life, who had come to a Sunday dinner in a house where something unexpected was happening, said I see in the tone of someone who had been piecing things together over the course of a meal and had now arrived at a conclusion. Sheila beside him was very still in the way people are still when they have understood something they cannot unhear. Graham, Janet's husband, Beth's father, cleared his throat once and looked at the table and said, Anne, just her name. Once, simply, in the voice of a man who has decided that the name alone will carry sufficient weight to stand in for everything else. And Richard, my brother, who had spent 30 years not seeing what was directly in front of him, who had moved through our family with the frictionless ease of the unchosen favorite. My brother looked at my mother and then looked at me, and his face did something I had not anticipated and have not entirely stopped thinking about since. His eyes filled, not crying, not quite, but the particular brightness of a person who has understood something too late and knows it. Janet cleared her throat. She said, quietly and precisely, Anne, she was sitting right here when you said 2 children. We all heard it. My mother's eyes moved around the table. I watched her do it, the automatic social survey, the instinctive search for the ally who would give her somewhere to land, some face that would offer her the lifeline of ambiguity. But there were no lifelines. Richard's face had gone closed and still. Beth was looking at her hands. Emma was crying silently, the way Emma cried, without sound. Tears just appearing. Philip and Sheila were looking at the table. Janet was looking at my mother with the calm, steady look of someone who has decided to bear witness. And I want you to understand what that felt like, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, at least not yet, with grief. Because what I was watching was the thing I had always half hoped I was wrong about proving itself true in front of everyone. It would have been easier in some ways if I had been wrong, if she had simply been stunned and confused and said, "Claire, no, that's not what I meant. That's not who I am." If there had been a version of this where the thing I had felt all my life turned out to be a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It never was. And now we were all in the room with the truth of it. I said, "I didn't do this to hurt you. I want you to understand that. I did this because I needed to know if I was crazy, if I had constructed this in my head. 29 years of feeling overlooked, of watching you look right through me. But I haven't constructed anything, have I? This week proved it. You gave Jane everything you've never given Claire. You were warm and interested and inviting. You asked her opinions and took walks with her and said she was easy to talk to. She was easy to talk to because she was me, Mum. I have always been exactly this person. You just never chose to see it. My mother had lost the flush. Her face was pale now and slightly collapsed, the way faces go when the architecture of certainty underneath them gives way. She said, voice lower, "Claire, you've always—" I said, "Don't say sensitive, please. Do not say that word." She closed her mouth. I said, "Here's what I need you to hear, and then I'm going to leave." I said, "You gave a toast at Richard's wedding, and you said 2 beautiful children. You've done it 5 times that Emma and I have found. You converted my bedroom into your craft room within 18 months of me leaving for university. You forgot my graduation. You've introduced Richard and Emma to every person in your life, and introduced me to none of them. You've spent 3 decades making sure I understood in ways small enough to deny individually but enormous in aggregate, that you wished I hadn't happened. And I'm not here to argue about any of it. I'm not here to make you confess or apologize or take back individual instances. I'm here because I needed to stop wondering if I was making it up." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "You don't have 2 children, Mum. You don't have 3 either, because as of today, you have exactly the number you've always wanted, the 2 you actually claimed." No one moved. The candles on the table had been burning this whole time, throwing their small, warm light over a room that had gone very still and very cold. Emma was crying properly now, the sound of it just audible. Richard had his hand flat on the table and was staring at the wood grain. Janet had her eyes closed. I picked up my bag from the back of my chair. It was not a dramatic gesture. I had put it there at the beginning of dinner, and I picked it up now, and I walked toward the door. My mother found her voice. She said, "Claire, wait, we can talk about this." I stopped. I turned back. I said, "You had 29 years to talk to me. You spent this week talking to Jane instead. That tells me everything I needed to know." And I walked out of the house in Headingley, past the blue door I had painted when I was 16, down the pavement under the bare November trees, and into the fog. I want to tell you what it felt like, walking away from that house, because I think people expect a particular thing from that moment, and what actually happened was stranger and more complicated than that. There was no rush of relief, no sudden weightlessness, the way people describe things like that. What there was a kind of quiet, the particular quiet of something that has been unresolved for so long that resolution itself feels like an unfamiliar texture. I walked for a long time before I got a cab, and the fog was still thick, and Leeds was doing what Leeds does on November evenings, going about its business with the particular undemonstrative persistence of a city that has been there since before most of its current occupants and will be there long after. I thought, walking, about the blue door, about the fact that she'd kept it blue for 13 years. I thought about whether that meant anything. I decided it probably didn't, not in the way I wanted it to. Some things are just the paint that's already on the door. The following days were their own strange weather. Emma called that evening, still shaken, and told me she'd stayed at the house until past 9. watching my mother sit at the table after everyone else had quietly found reasons to leave. She said my mother had not moved for a long time. She said Richard had stayed too, and he and my mother had talked. And it had not gone easily because Richard was finally understanding something he had been carefully not understanding for 30 years, and that is its own kind of reckoning. Emma said Janet had squeezed my mother's hand on the way out and said, "You need to think very carefully about what you've done." In the first 2 weeks after that Sunday, my mother called 47 times. I know that number because I counted them in my call log, the same way I had once stood in a wedding reception counting the people who had heard her say, "2 beautiful children." The counting was not obsessive. It was just the way I processed information, by making it specific and real and impossible to dismiss. She called 47 times. She sent 11 emails. 3 letters arrived at Emma's flat. She showed up at Emma's building once, on a Thursday afternoon, and Emma went down to talk to her in the doorway while I sat in the flat upstairs listening to the murmur of voices that did not include mine. Emma came back up and sat across from me at her kitchen table and said, "She wants to explain." I said, "I know." Emma said, "She seems genuinely, I don't know, undone." I thought about this. I said, "I believe that. I think she is." I think she had a version of herself that she'd been maintaining for a long time, the version that was a good mother, a warm person, a woman who had simply been handed a difficult child, and the last 8 days dismantled it. I think she's genuinely suffering, and I also think that the suffering she's feeling now is the echo of what I felt for 29 years, just compressed into 2 weeks, so I'm not able to rush to relieve it. Emma nodded. I said, also, "I can't be the person who manages her feelings right now. That's all I've ever done. That's the pattern. She hurts me, and I absorb it, and I soften it, and I find a way to make it acceptable, and we continue. I can't continue." What came next was something I hadn't fully anticipated, which was the structural unraveling. Because here is what I had been, in that family, without anyone having clearly seen it, the person who ran the invisible maintenance. The birthdays remembered and gifts organized, the photo albums, the coordinated dinners for Richard and Emma that my mother hosted and took credit for while I had sourced the caterers and confirmed the RSVPs and ordered the flowers. Margaret's birthday, which I had remembered for 6 consecutive years, and for which I had bought and posted a card in my mother's name, because my mother invariably forgot and then felt embarrassed and asked me to sort it. The Christmas cards. The small social infrastructure that keeps a family feeling like a family, all of it had been quietly running on me. I had not done any of this begrudgingly. I want to be clear about that. I'd done it because I loved my family and because love, when it cannot express itself through the direct channels of warmth and belonging, finds other roots. It metabolizes into usefulness, into service, into the endless quiet management of other people's comfort. I had organized Richard's 40th birthday dinner, coordinating with Beth and Emma over 4 months, sourcing a restaurant that could accommodate his food preferences and his closest friends' schedules, writing the toast that my mother delivered at the table as though she had composed it herself. I had sat in this kitchen the day before my mother's book club hosted their Christmas gathering and helped her make the biscuits she was bringing, the ones she presented to Margaret's group as her own recipe, which she had gotten from me after I'd made them at her house 2 Christmases earlier. None of this was dramatic. None of it announced itself. It was the invisible work, the connective tissue work, and it was mine, and I had offered it freely because it was what I could give when what I actually wanted, to be seen, acknowledged, included, was not available. When it stopped, the absence of it was more visible than the thing itself had ever been. That is the particular irony of invisible work. No one notices it happening, and everyone notices when it stops. Emma told me, months later, that the Christmas without cards was the first time she fully understood what I had been doing all those years, not because she had been ungrateful, but because she had genuinely not known the architecture of it, had assumed the cards simply existed, the way birthday acknowledgments simply existed, the way the family administrative layer simply existed. without a person underneath it, maintaining the whole structure. In January, Margaret's birthday passed without acknowledgement. My mother genuinely did not remember it without the prompt that had always arrived from me. Margaret noticed. Margaret said nothing, but noticed. The Christmas card did not go out. My mother realized this sometime in mid-December, and apparently called Emma in a mild panic, and Emma said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what to do," and that was the end of it. Emma and Richard, furious in their separate ways, declined to step in. Emma because she had always known and was done pretending she hadn't. Richard because he was going through the late, difficult work of recognizing something about his mother that he had never needed to see before, and the process of it had made him quiet and careful in a way his usual optimism hadn't prepared him for. My mother called Emma crying in January. She said, "I don't know how to fix this. Claire won't speak to me." Emma told me what she'd said in response. She had said, "You can't fix it, Mum. You spent 3 decades breaking it. Claire was right there, trying to be seen, and you looked right through her. Now she's gone, and you finally notice. That's not a problem with a solution. That's just a consequence." I moved to Edinburgh in February. The design job had been in the works for a while. I had been freelancing in London, and a studio in Edinburgh had offered me a permanent position months earlier, and I'd been sitting on it, not quite ready to make the change. After November, I was ready. Edinburgh was far enough from Leeds to feel like a new thing and close enough to be reachable when Emma wanted to visit on a weekend. I want to tell you about the Edinburgh decision because it was its own kind of answer to something my mother had said. That I drifted, that I had no direction, that I'd never built anything. As it turned out, the thing I hadn't been able to build was not a career or a life, or any of the external structures. It was a version of myself that could thrive inside her orbit. Once I removed myself from her orbit, direction came easily. The studio was good work. My colleagues were good people. The city had a quality of light in winter that was not warm but was clarifying. Everything very sharp-edged, the old stone dark with rain, and I found I needed that clarity in exactly the specific way I hadn't known I was missing it. Richard and Emma visited in March. Both of them, separately. Richard on a work trip that he rerouted through Edinburgh on a Friday afternoon and stayed through Sunday, Emma the following weekend. We went to a pub on the Royal Mile, and I watched my brother try to find the right words for something he was still processing, and eventually he said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it." And I believed him, because Richard had genuinely not seen it, which was its own complicated thing, not malice, just the privilege of the easy child, the one who had never needed to count. I told him I knew, and I meant it. Emma's visit the following weekend was different in texture. She arrived Friday evening on the train, slightly damp from the walk from Waverley, and we ate dinner in my flat and talked until past midnight, the way we'd been doing since she was 19, and I was 23, and we'd had our first real conversation as adults, rather than as the sister-shaped furniture we'd been to each other for most of our childhoods. Emma had been processing in her own way, and her processing had moved her somewhere I hadn't expected. She said, "I've been thinking about what she must have been like before she had children. What she was expecting, what she thought having a family would look like." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I think," and I'm not saying this to excuse her, I promise I'm not, but I think she had a version in her head of what her children would be like, and you didn't match it, not because you did anything wrong. Just because you were a specific particular person and specific particular people don't always fit the version someone has built in their head. And instead of adjusting the version, she subtracted you from it instead. I thought about this for a while. I said, that might be exactly right. And it might even be true. And it still doesn't make it acceptable. Emma said, "No, I know." We sat with that. She said, "Do you think you'll ever see her again?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe. But not until I trust that being in the same room with her won't require me to make myself smaller to do it. And that's a test she'll need to pass before I'll put myself back in that room." Emma nodded. She said, "That's fair." It kept being fair. Fairness kept being the floor I came back to when other things got complicated. And then in April, my mother sent a birthday card. She had never forgotten a birthday. I'll give her that. The mechanism of birthday acknowledgement had always worked in her, even when everything else had failed. Inside the card, in her handwriting, careful and slightly different from usual, the handwriting of someone who had rewritten the sentence a few times before committing to it, was this: I am grateful for my 3 children. I read it standing in the hallway of my flat in Edinburgh, wearing my coat because I had just come in from outside. I stood there with the card in my hands and the fog of my own breath in the cold hallway, and I read it 3 times. Too little, 8 months too late. And still, I noticed it, and will not pretend I didn't. Still conditional, in a way. She only remembered I existed after I disappeared. She only wrote 3 when the absence of the 3rd had become something she could feel. 3 written in a birthday card is not the same as 3 lived for 29 years. It is not the same as 2 stockings on a fireplace and a Sharpie name on felt. It is not the same as a toast at a wedding in front of 47 people. It is a word on a card, written in the aftermath of consequence. I did not respond, but I kept the card. I put it in a drawer. I'm not sure yet what to do with that impulse. Margaret sent me a message in March. This was perhaps the most unexpected thing in all of it. I hadn't given Margaret my contact information, but she had found me through Emma, and the message was brief and direct in the way Margaret had always been. Your mother talks about you constantly now, what you're doing, how proud she is. I told her it's a bit late for that. Then a pause, and then the thing I have thought about since. For what it's worth, I always counted 3. I read that message on a Tuesday morning in Edinburgh before I'd had coffee, and I sat with it for a long time. For what it's worth, I always counted 3. Margaret, who had been my mother's friend for 20 years, who had been in the room for so many of the occasions where I had been edited out, who had heard, on that Friday afternoon when the kitchen window was open, my mother say she'd stopped expecting anything from me because it was easier, who had pushed back gently and been brushed aside, who had, throughout all of it, privately maintained the accurate count. I wrote back to Margaret. I said, "Thank you for that. It means more than you know." She wrote back, "Come for tea if you're ever in Leeds." I'm always in. I think I will one day. Emma asked me on one of her Edinburgh visits whether I'd ever consider reconciliation. She asked it carefully, the way you ask something you're not sure you should be asking. She wasn't advocating for my mother. She was asking because she's the person who loves both of us and lives with the grief of the gap between us. And she was asking honestly. I thought about it. I gave it the genuine consideration it deserved because I owe Emma honesty and I owe myself the work of not making reflexive decisions. Then I said, she didn't lose me in November. She just finally noticed I'd been gone for years. Emma was quiet. Then she nodded. I said, I'm not ruling anything out forever. I'm not interested in permanent declarations. But I'm also not going to rush toward a repair that would require me to minimize what happened. I've spent a lifetime making my own wounds small enough to be manageable to other people. I don't want to do that anymore. Emma said, that's fair. And it is. It is fair. More than fair. It is the most basic exercise of self-respect, which is this: to finally, at 29 years old, take seriously the evidence of your own life. My mother had 2 children. She had always said so. 2 stockings on the fireplace, 2 beautiful children at the wedding, 2 wonderful children at the Sunday dinner in November. She had wanted 2. She had claimed 2. She had built her entire maternal identity around 2. Now she had exactly that. 2 children who lived their lives in relation to her, who called and visited and maintained the connection. And 1 daughter who had been gone for years by the time anyone noticed. 1 daughter who had been carrying the invisible work of the family like furniture carries weight, present, load-bearing, never acknowledged until something needs to be moved and it isn't there. I am not invisible anymore. Not because my mother finally wrote the number 3 in a birthday card, but because I stopped accepting the smaller space. I stopped maintaining the systems that made her comfortable. I stopped smoothing over the rough edges of her contempt and calling it family loyalty. I woke up one morning in Edinburgh, in a flat that was mine, in a city I had chosen, doing work I was good at, and the fog was doing what Edinburgh fog does, sitting on Arthur's seat, softening the edges of the old city, making everything slightly mythological and slightly internal. And I thought, I am not who she said I was. I never was. She was wrong, and she was wrong for 29 years. And the only version of me that ever believed her was the one who had no other information to go on. The one who counted 3 always had more information than she knew what to do with. There is something that happens in families built on silence and erasure that research has begun to document with real seriousness. Psychologists who study what they call emotional invalidation, the consistent denial of a person's internal experience, the teaching that what you feel is not real, that what you perceive is oversensitivity, have found effects that are measurable and lasting. It affects self-worth, obviously. That is the visible damage. But the deeper damage is epistemic. When you grow up in an environment where your own perceptions are routinely corrected by someone with authority over you, you stop trusting what you see. You develop a particular kind of second-guessing, a habitual doubt about your own experience that follows you into every room you enter. You become excessively good at seeing other people's perspectives. You become excessively bad at trusting your own. What I did in November was not revenge, exactly. It was verification. I needed to see with the clearest possible eyes whether the thing I had always known was the thing that was actually happening. And it was. It was. The kindness she showed Jane was real. The contempt she carried for Claire was real. The gap between those two was not imagined or distorted or oversensitive. It was documented. It was witnessed. It was the accumulated proof of a truth I had been fighting to hold on to for 24 years against a constant, patient pressure to let it go. You might be watching this and thinking about someone in your own life who uses your sensitivity against you, who turns your accurate perception of their behavior into evidence of your dysfunction. If you are, listen to that pattern. Not because sensitivity is not real, not because we are all always correct in our perceptions, but because there is a specific, identifiable tactic in which someone consistently reframes your observation as the problem rather than the thing you observed. That is a habit worth examining closely, in them and in yourself. You do not owe anyone the erasure of your own experience, not for peace, not for family, not for the comfortable maintenance of a story about your family that requires you to make yourself smaller than you are. Margaret counted 3. She always did. Start counting yourself. You deserve to be in the count. If this story moved you, if you recognized something in it, if it gave you words for something you've been carrying, please leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need it most. And I believe some of you found this video for a reason. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Has anyone in your life ever used your sensitivity against you the way Claire's mother did? Have you ever had to provide your own proof that something real was happening? Tell me your story. This community shows up for each other in the comments section in ways I am genuinely grateful for. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and if you're already subscribed, thank you for being here. I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop your city and time in the comments. There's something I love about knowing that people in completely different places are sitting with the same story at the same moment. And the video coming up on your screen right now, I need you to see it before you go. It is a story about a daughter who discovers at the reading of her father's will that she was left something that none of her siblings were. What she was left is not money. What she was left changes everything she thought she understood about her family for 40 years. I'll be honest with you, that one hit differently. Don't sleep on it. Take care of yourselves. I mean that.